The large naval hall was alive with voices and footsteps, polished shoes clicking on the tile, uniforms sharp and perfect under bright white lights. Men and women in decorated jackets stood in groups whispering about ranks and missions and contracts. And then the door opened quietly, and a woman walked in, and the room tilted. Her blouse was wrinkled like it had been left at the bottom of a drawer. Her khaki pants faded from years of wear, her sneakers scuffed and laces frayed. Her hair loose and simple without style. No jewelry, no makeup, nothing that fit the scene. She looked like a tired civilian who had taken a wrong turn. And 3 young officers near the coffee table burst into laughter. One nudged the other and said loud enough for half the room to hear that maybe she was there to deliver napkins. The woman said nothing, her face calm and unreadable. She walked to a corner by a tall window and stood silently, her posture straight but not stiff, her hands loose at her sides, her eyes dark and steady, the kind of eyes that did not wander, the kind of eyes that measured people carefully, and yet the room saw only the clothes, the sneakers, the plain look, and decided she was no one. The naval base was filled that day with powerful guests, admirals with rows of medals, defense contractors with golden watches, foreign delegates with crisp accents, aides running with clipboards, photographers adjusting, cameras. Every detail of the rehearsal for the ceremony polished and perfect. Everything except her, standing in the corner like she did not belong. And the whispers started to grow, curious and cruel at the same time. The first officer with slicked hair laughed again and said, maybe she was lost. Maybe someone should point her to the service entrance. His friends chuckled nervously, their voices bouncing off the walls, and the crowd began to notice, turning heads, glancing at her sneakers, glancing at the quiet way she stood. One aide at the registration table leaned toward another and whispered with a smirk, "Who let her in here?" She must have slipped past security. Woman stayed still, her gaze on the window, watching the gray Virginia sky where seagulls floated over the water. Her fingers pressed lightly around something in her pocket, a small leather case that no one else noticed. And for a moment she looked like a shadow on the edge of the crowd, invisible and patient, like she was waiting for something the others could not see. Then a junior aide, young and eager, stepped toward her, his clipboard shaking slightly in his hands, his voice louder than it needed to be as he called to her. "Ma'am, this section is for ceremony participants. If you are delivering something, the loading docks are at the back." His words carried across the hall, enough to make a few officers laugh again, enough to turn more faces toward her. She turned slowly, her expression calm, her eyes meeting his with steady weight. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the small ID case and handed it to him, without a word. He flipped it open, frowned at the faded picture and the worn edges, muttering under his breath that it did not look right, maybe even fake. But then he looked at her again, and his voice faltered, something in her gaze pressing against him like a silent warning, and he mumbled an apology before handing it back. And retreating, the young officers snickered again, one saying louder that anyone could print badges online, the others smirking, testing the room, testing her, but she did not rise to it. She gave only the smallest nod, then looked back out the window as if they were less than dust in the air. The atmosphere shifted slightly, just a ripple at first, as a man in a gray suit walked past, older with silver hair, a quiet authority in his step. His eyes caught hers for a second, and without hesitation he gave a small, respectful nod, the kind of nod that said he knew her, the kind of nod that froze the mocking officers in place, their grins slipping, their voices caught in their throats, because no man like him would nod to a nobody. Whispers began to stir in the back, low voices asking, "Who is she? Do you know her? Is she really just a civilian?" But no answers came. Only the low hum of unease spreading through the room. Still she stood there, alone in her corner, sneakers pressed to the tile, blouse wrinkled and plain, a figure judged and dismissed by those around her, yet her silence grew heavier by the minute, and the people mocking her began to shift nervously as if they had misjudged something, as if maybe the joke was no longer safe. And then the faint sound rolled through the air, a low thunder from outside, steady and powerful, not from footsteps or voices, but from the sky. Blades cutting the wind, the unmistakable rhythm of helicopters moving closer, the glass of the tall window behind her faintly trembling with each beat. And though the officers laughed louder to cover their unease, though the aides barked orders to keep the rehearsal going, eyes began to drift toward the gray clouds beyond the bay. She stayed silent, her eyes on the horizon, her hand brushing the ID case in her pocket, her face calm and unshaken, like someone who already knew why the sound was coming. The others did. Not yet understand, but the sky was already answering for her, and the first part of her story had only just begun. The thunder of helicopters still echoed faintly outside, but inside the naval hall the laughter had returned, sharper and more cruel than before. The three young officers at the coffee table leaned against the counter with smug grins, their voices carrying louder across the hall as if they wanted the whole room to hear. One said she must be lost. Another said maybe she was hired to clean up after the ceremony. The third raised his cup and laughed that perhaps she was there to refill napkins and cups, and each laugh cut like a small blade meant to humiliate her. The woman did not flinch. She did not answer. Her eyes stayed on the window where the gray sky rolled heavy with clouds. Her fingers still rested on the worn leather case in her pocket, and though the room was buzzing with mockery, she looked calm, like she knew something no one else could see, like she was standing at the edge of a storm that only she could hear. A few aides at the registration table glanced toward her. One leaned to another with a whisper sharp enough to sting. She should not be here. She does not fit. Someone must have slipped, the smirk on their faces spreading like fire as more heads turned. And soon the murmurs circled the room. Who is she? What is she doing here? Why is she standing so still? But no answer came. Only more laughter. Then it happened. A man in a gray suit passed by, his hair silver, his face marked by lines of command and years of service. He did not laugh. He did not sneer. He simply stopped for a moment, his eyes locking with hers, and then he gave a single nod, small but filled with weight, a nod of recognition, a nod of respect, and in that instant the air shifted. The mocking officers froze, their laughter stuck in their throats, because no man like him would nod to a nobody. The silver-haired man walked on without speaking, his shoes clicking steady against the floor, yet his gesture lingered heavy in the space. People whispered to each other now with different tones, not mocking but uncertain, not laughing but questioning. Who is she? Do you know her? What does that nod mean? But the woman in the corner gave no answer. She remained silent and steady like stone. The officers, embarrassed but not ready to let go, returned to their game. One approached her with a false smile, his voice dripping with fake politeness. Miss, logistics rooms are down the hall. This is for VIPs only. His friends laughed softly behind him, their eyes gleaming as if this was some cruel contest. To push her, to break her silence, to force her to admit she did not belong. But she turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his, and her voice came low and steady. Am I? Just 2 words, yet it felt like a blade sliding across his arrogance. He blinked, caught off guard, his smile faltering. But he tried to recover with a laugh. Yes, you are. This place is not for you. This is a place for important people. Before he could add more, the sound of firm steps cut through the chatter, and a tall colonel appeared, his uniform heavy with ribbons, his face stern, his voice sharp as he asked what is happening here. Why the noise? The officer stammered, his words stumbling as he tried to explain, but the colonel ignored him. His eyes fell on the woman. She handed him her worn ID case without a word. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the faded photo, and then he stopped, his expression freezing, his voice lowering as he read the name, Sarah Monroe. His tone shifted, softer now, almost careful. He closed the case, handed it back, and said clearly enough for all nearby to hear, "Let her through. She does not need a new badge." The young officers froze, their faces pale, their laughter gone. The aides at the table exchanged confused looks, and the whispers began again. But now, with urgency, Sarah Monroe, could it be her? The name spreading like sparks through dry grass, stories half remembered, tales of missions whispered in mess halls and barracks, but no one dared to say them too loudly yet. The doubt still clinging, she nodded once to the colonel, slipped the case back into her pocket, and walked calmly past the stunned officers. Her sneakers soft on the tile, her face unchanged, her silence heavier now than the noise of the room. And though people turned to stare, she gave them nothing. No answer, no expression, only the stillness that seemed to grow with every step. A young female officer, her uniform neat and posture crisp, hesitated before stepping close to her, her voice low and careful. "You are not what I expected. They said you were a legend." She looked at Sarah's plain clothes with confusion. The woman reached into her pocket again, pulled out a small weathered coin, edges worn smooth, and placed it into the young officer's hand. "Expect less," she said softly, then turned her eyes back to the window, leaving the officer trembling as she turned the coin over and saw the insignia etched deep into its face. The whispers spread faster now. The phantom of Ormoc Bay, could it be true? Is that her? But Sarah did not answer. She did not even move. Her hands rested on the windowsill, her gaze locked on the horizon, her figure quiet but unshaken, while around her the room was no longer laughing. The room was questioning, and slowly, very slowly, the balance of power began to tilt. The helicopters outside thundered again, closer, now rattling the glass panes with each heavy rotation, and the crowd stirred with unease, some turning to the window, some turning back to her, but all feeling the same heavy truth. The civilian they mocked might not be a civilian at all, and the storm outside was not just for the ceremony, it was coming for her. The colonel's words still echoed in the naval hall. "Let her through," he had said, and though his voice was calm, the effect was like thunder. The young officers who had mocked her stood frozen, their grins gone, their faces pale, and the aides at the tables whispered in confusion, some leaning closer, some pulling back. The name Sarah Monroe already running through the room like fire, but no one yet dared to speak what they truly feared. She moved with steady steps, sneakers soft against the tile, her face calm, her hands at her sides. She passed through the wide doors into the restricted area where only VIPs and officers of high rank were allowed. Heads turned as she walked, whispers rising behind her, some mocking still, some uncertain. And though she gave them nothing, the silence around her grew heavier, like every breath in the room was waiting for something to happen. The ceremony rehearsal was in full swing. Flags from many nations lined the stage. Aides rushed with tablets and clipboards. A man in a navy suit tested the microphone, his voice echoing across the hall. But even as he spoke, his eyes drifted toward her, toward the woman in the wrinkled blouse and faded pants, and he frowned, muttering to a colleague that she was not on the list. She took a seat near the front row, not at the center, not with pride, but at the edge like a shadow, quiet, unnoticed by many, yet seen by all who dared to look, and soon the laughter began again. Though softer now, a delegate in a sharp suit smirked that she was sitting in the wrong place. A woman in a black dress whispered that no one was enforcing dress code. The words cut across the air like small arrows. But Sarah did not move, her eyes fixed on the stage, her body still as stone. Then the announcer at the podium cleared his throat, his tablet in hand. He read from the list of names for the rehearsal, calling dignitaries, calling admirals, calling guests, and then his brow furrowed as he read one more name, Sarah Monroe. his voice uncertain, his eyes searching the room. The crowd laughed lightly, some shaking their heads. "Must be a mistake," one man muttered. "Must be a typo," another whispered. Yet no one noticed her standing slowly, walking with calm steps toward the podium. She reached the front, her sneakers almost silent. The announcer blinked, surprised, unsure, and he tried to say something, but the words failed, because she stood there now before the microphone. No notes in her hands, no speech prepared, only her voice, low and steady, carrying across the hall like a tide. She began to speak, not loudly, not with theatrics, but with clarity, recounting a mission in the South China Sea, a night when the waves were high and the sky was black, when the enemy pressed with torpedoes and men screamed through radios. She spoke of coordinates, of code, names, of a 7-minute sequence that turned chaos into survival, every word exact, every memory sharp. And as she spoke, the laughter died. The whispers vanished. The hall went silent. Veterans in the crowd leaned forward, their eyes wide, their mouths tight. One older officer in the front row nodded slowly, recognition heavy in his face. He had been there. He knew the truth of her words. He felt the memory like a scar, and he whispered softly to no one in particular. "It is her. It really is her." The silence in the hall was painful, the kind that pressed against the ears. No one dared to break it. No one dared to laugh now. The men who had mocked her sat frozen, their hands tight on their knees, their faces drained of color, and even the politicians with smug smiles shifted in their seats, their confidence slipping away as her calm voice painted scenes of fire and survival. She finished without flourish, without raising her hands. She simply stopped speaking, stepped back from the microphone, and turned, her eyes calm as always, her face unreadable, and she walked back to her seat at the edge of the row, the silence hanging like a storm waiting to break. Then the sound came, deep and heavy, shaking the windows of the hall, a horn carried from the water beyond the base, long and powerful, the kind of horn that spoke of steel and command, the kind of horn that belonged to one ship only. And the whispers began again. Louder this time, urgent this time. The USS Gerald R. Ford. It is here. It is coming. The audience rushed toward the windows, pushing to see, their faces pressed to the glass, the mist over the bay shifting, the massive silhouette of the carrier emerging like a ghost from the gray horizon, its deck wide and endless, its towers cutting the sky. And the hall trembled with its presence, the most powerful warship alive. But Sarah did not rise. She stayed still at her seat, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes steady, her calm silence heavier now than the thunder of the horn. And those who looked at her could not help but feel it, the strange pull of someone who had been doubted, mocked, dismissed, yet stood stronger than all the noise around her. The crowd shouted, the announcer stammered, aides ran to adjust schedules. The room dissolved into chaos, but at the center of it sat one woman, plain in her clothes, plain in her posture, yet holding the weight of a legend, and the storm outside seemed to come for her alone. The horn of the USS Gerald R. Ford still echoed across the naval base, long and deep, rolling through the glass of the hall like thunder from the ocean. Men and women in sharp uniforms pressed against the windows, their eyes wide, their voices. Stumbling over each other, the mist parted slowly, and the massive shape of the carrier pushed through like a mountain of steel. Its deck stretched wide and endless, its towers reaching high, and its presence silenced even the proudest voices in the room. Inside the hall, the announcer froze, his speech forgotten. Aides dropped clipboards. Politicians who had smirked now stared with pale faces. The young officers who had mocked the woman earlier shifted nervously, their arrogance stripped away as the horn sounded again, heavier this time, a call that no one could ignore. And still she sat calm at her seat, her plain blouse wrinkled, her sneakers faded, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her silence louder than the chaos. Then the sound changed. a deep rumble from above, the rhythmic chopping of blades slicing. The air, windows rattling harder, the crowd turning in confusion, and soon a Black Hawk helicopter appeared, its silhouette cutting through the mist, dropping low toward the green lawn outside the hall, its blades whipping dust and leaves into a storm, soldiers outside shouting and scrambling to secure the landing zone as the machine descended with force. The doors of the hall shook as the Black Hawk touched down, its roar filling every corner, and then they opened, wide and heavy, and a man stepped inside, his boots striking the tile like hammers, his uniform marked with special patches, his eyes sharp and unyielding, the kind of soldier who carried authority. Without speaking, the kind of presence that pulled every gaze in the room toward him. He did not look at the crowd. He did not glance at the admirals or the contractors or the politicians. He looked only at her, sitting quiet at the edge of the row, his voice cutting clear over the noise. "Captain Monroe, your escort is waiting." The room froze, the words hanging heavy in the air. "Captain Monroe." The title cracked the silence like glass. The young officers stared wide-eyed. The aides dropped their pens. The smug politicians shifted uncomfortably, and even the announcer, who still held his tablet, felt his throat dry. Because the woman they had mocked, the woman they had called civilian, was now revealed as a captain called by name. Sarah Monroe rose slowly, her face unchanged, her calm eyes steady. She picked up her small leather ID case, slipping it into her pocket with quiet grace, then walked forward, her sneakers soft on the floor, yet somehow louder than the roar of the helicopter outside, each step pulling the air tighter, each movement reminding the crowd of their mistakes. No one dared to block her path, not the aides with their tablets, not the contractors with their smug smiles, not the officers who had mocked her. They stepped aside without words, their heads lowering slightly, their eyes following her with a mix of fear and awe because respect had been forced into their bones now, respect that no speech could command, only truth could. She reached the soldier, nodded once, and together they walked toward the open doors. The wind from the helicopter whipping through the hall, scattering papers across the floor, pulling at suits and uniforms, the noise drowning out every whisper, and yet in the middle of that storm, her calm silence still carried weight, as if she owned the air itself. Outside on the lawn, mechanics froze in their work. One young technician dropped his wrench as he saw her step forward, his coveralls stained with grease, his voice low with disbelief. "That is her. The one from the stories." His partner nodded slowly, eyes wide, unable to speak. The legend they had whispered about now, walking past them with plain sneakers and steady steps. The helicopter blade spun faster, the roar nearly deafening, but the crowd inside the hall had no ears for the sound. Their attention locked on the simple woman who had entered as no one, mocked and doubted, now leaving as Captain Monroe escorted by special forces, their arrogance shattered, their laughter turned to silence, their whispers turned to shame. The Black Hawk door was open. The soldier stepped aside for her, and she paused at the threshold, her hand resting lightly on the frame, her eyes drifting back for just a moment toward the hall, toward the crowd of officers and guests who stood frozen, some ashamed, some humbled, and some still unable to believe what they had seen. Then her gaze shifted to the horizon, steady and calm as always. She climbed aboard, her hands folding in her lap, her back straight but not stiff, her silence still unbroken, and the soldier who sat across from her gave a small nod, quiet and respectful, a nod that said everything without words, and she returned it with the faintest curve of her lips, almost a smile, but not quite. The helicopter lifted slowly, the wind ripping across the lawn, the roar shaking the hall behind, the USS Gerald R looming in the distance, its deck waiting like a throne of steel, and as the Black Hawk rose higher, the crowd pressed against the windows, watching the woman they had dismissed carried away by power greater than any of them had known. The horn of the carrier sounded once more, deep and final, and the truth hung heavy in the air. The civilian they mocked was no civilian at all, and the storm had always been for her. The Black Hawk lifted higher into the gray Virginia sky, its blades cutting the air with a thunder that rolled over the naval base. The crowd pressed against the windows of the hall, their eyes fixed on the shrinking figure inside the helicopter. The woman they had called just a civilian now carried away under the escort of special forces, her presence heavier in absence than it had been in silence. On the ground, the whispers started again, sharper now. Cutting through the noise of the ceremony, aides muttered nervously as they gathered scattered papers. Officers stood stiff with faces pale, contractors exchanged uneasy glances, and politicians shifted in their seats with forced smiles that no longer convinced anyone, because the truth had walked through their hall and left them exposed. The young officers who had mocked her the loudest felt the weight first, called into offices where stern voices demanded explanations. By the end of the week, one was reassigned to a distant post, another buried in paperwork at a desk. Their careers clipped before they could rise, their laughter remembered only as arrogance, their names whispered with pity, not pride. The aide who had questioned her badge found himself written up for lack of judgment, his supervisor noting failure to recognize rank, his confidence broken. The contractor who had mocked her ID with a smirk was released quietly from his firm, his face scrubbed from company pages, his phone calls left unanswered, and the woman in the black dress with her sharp tongue and online following posted an apology no one believed. Her contracts drying, up like water in the sun. Even the politician who had dismissed her as a ghost of the past felt the shadow of consequence. His speech cut from recordings, his name missing from new invitations. Whispers in back rooms said his career had slipped, and though he smiled for cameras, his eyes betrayed the truth. He had gambled against silence and lost, but Sarah Monroe did not see any of it. She was gone before the whispers could settle, gone before the punishments and apologies, gone with the roar of the helicopter carrying her toward the steel giant waiting on the water, the USS Gerald R looming like a mountain in the mist, its deck alive with sailors standing ready, its horn sounding again as the Black Hawk approached. She sat in the cabin, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady on the horizon, her face calm, not proud, not bitter, simply quiet. The soldier across from her sat rigid, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his eyes on her, and after a long silence he gave a small nod, the kind of nod that carried respect without words, the kind that said he knew who she was, and she returned it softly with the faintest curve of her lips. On the deck, sailors straightened as the helicopter touched down, their uniforms whipped by the wind, their boots planted firm, their eyes wide as the door opened, and she stepped out. Plain clothes against the storm, sneakers on